All right. So again, welcome everyone to this Fusion 360 deep dive into the rendering session, into the rendering workspace. My name is Jamie Scherer. I am one of the Fusion adoption managers on the customer adoption team. Our team is wholly focused on helping new users like yourselves learn how to use Fusion, right? How do we help you, answer the questions that you need when you need them, ramp up and increase, speed up the adoption process from maybe using some of the tools that you've used in the past and start to use Fusion in your design and engineering practices. A little bit about myself. I've been with Autodesk since about 2010, working in a number of different roles, always focused on our manufacturing solutions. Prior to Autodesk, I worked as a designer for a yacht company located in New Jersey. So good afternoon for those of you that are also on the East Coast. Through a number of different, kind of tools and roles and functionality, or I should say roles and responsibilities along the way, I've used many different both design tools and rendering tools in many different organizations, and really excited to talk about the Fusion 360 rendering workspace, which is both one of my favorite parts of Fusion, not only to to visualize and see what my designs look like before they're real, but also because of the ease of use, right? And couple that with, the functionality, the capabilities that we have to create photorealistic renderings. I'm hoping this is going to be really exciting, fun discussion for everyone today. So again, thanks again for joining, and let's get kicked off. So what I wanted to dive into today, really from the top down, using the rendering workspace inside of Fusion 360, and we're going to go through a bunch of different parts of Fusion, right? First and foremost, how do we apply appearances, right? Create and apply photorealistic materials, control things like, bump map and textures, roughness, so that we can, of course, dial in and make our designs look as realistic as possible. Next up, we'll go through the scene settings in the rendering workspace. How do we apply backgrounds, tweak our camera settings, and control the environment so that we can, not only create varying images, but make sure that we're putting them in realistic environments, or using the best settings to create brochure, photoreal, marketing materials coming out of Fusion. We'll talk a little bit about decals, texture map controls. How do we control the projection maps of textures, and then ultimately the coup de grace ray tracing. How do we what are the different ways that we can calculate and ray trace inside of Fusion? How do you use them? And then we'll tie that back into some deeper topics with some of the time that we have at the end. So the last thing that I wanted to do, just kind of threw this in here a minute ago, and I'm going to throw a poll up in a second. So I've got these two cameras up on the screen, and I'm going to open up a poll, and I'm curious which one of these is Fusion. And I'd love to see what you guys think. I'm going to launch the poll, and hopefully you had a look at what they looked like. The left one, the right one, are they both rendered from Fusion? Are neither of them rendered from Fusion? The choices, so many different possibilities. The one on the left, the one on the right, are they both from Fusion? Neither. Is this some type of a trick? Do I just own old photography and I took pictures of them in my garage? I'm going to close the poll right there, and so here's the results. And Adele said couldn't see. I'm going to put the picture back up there. Take a look at it. Let me know. You can type it in the Q&A panel. But the results as they are so far, 18% of you guessed the one on the left. 57% of you guessed the one on the right. 17 said both. A couple people said neither. So I'm going to close the poll. We'll open that. We'll dive right back into our slide right here, and hopefully those of you that didn't see it before can see it. So 17% of you said that the one on the left was Fusion, 57% said the one on the right is Fusion, and 17% of you were right, and it's almost 60% of you were, I'll say, not correct today. So in actuality, the important thing is that one of them is Fusion, the one on the left is Fusion, the one on the right was rendered in 3D Studio Max. And I think if you, now that you have a little bit more time to dial and kind of look at the examples, the one on the left I did honestly in a matter of minutes. In probably less than an hour's worth of time, I created that rendering on the left. And my purpose was to try to, compare it to a rendering that I saw that was rendered in 3D Studio Max, which is, kind of one of the pillars of visualization in the industry, and creating high quality animations and visualizations. So, the real important takeaway that I wanted to show everyone in this example is that Fusion's rendering capabilities are not only, pretty incredible, very easy to use, very accessible, and embedded directly inside of the design tool that hopefully you guys are taking advantage of. And if you haven't had a chance to look, I encourage you to get out into the Fusion 360 gallery, look at some of the incredible renderings and designs that people are doing every day inside of Fusion. We'll talk about it later, but just wanted to kick us off with a quick example just to talk about what's possible, what we can do inside of Fusion 360. All right, so without further ado, no more slides. Let's jump in. So what I'm going to do today, and I actually have I've opened up an example that already has some textures applied, and that's okay. We're just gonna wipe these out, and we're gonna start again from the beginning. But in this example, what I want to do is go through how we would use the Fusion 360 rendering tools to render out this reciprocating saw that was designed inside of Fusion 360. So if you're new to Fusion, I see at least one person mentioned in the Q&A panel that they were new to Fusion and also interested in any and all sessions. Robert, I'll talk more about some of the other sessions that Marty, myself, some of our colleagues on our team are doing on a weekly basis. I encourage you to join those. But if you're new to Fusion, if you just started using Fusion, you've probably spent the majority of your time inside of the model workspace, right? Which is kind of the workspace that you start off in. It's our 3D solid parametric workspace. And if you haven't had a chance to yet, if you click on the model workspace or the workspace dropdown in the upper left-hand corner, you'll find a number of different other workspaces. And those workspaces are kind of broken up functionally by different, I'll say modeling techniques or, parts of Fusion. So you'll see the patch environment, which is where we, create surfaces, animation, simulation, simulation being where we validate and run finite element analysis, the CAM environment where we create tool paths and export G-code to machine parts. And so of course the one that I skipped over in the middle is the render workspace. So that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. But what's important to know is that the techniques, the appearances that I'll be adding inside of the render workspace are the same appearances that are inside of the model workspace. So while you're designing and you're applying appearances to start to visualize what a design looks like, those same appearances are inside of the render workspace. So there's, you're not going to switch from one material library to another, have completely different reflections or shadows or, or textures or something like that. The materials that you use in one workspace are the same in the other, which is fantastic, and an important piece of, kind of using this unified modeling environment. Okay, so let's dive in. The way that I always like to talk about the render workspace inside of Fusion 360, as well as some of our other environments as well. CAM and simulation are great examples where we typically work left to right. So if you look at the user interface working from left to right, the first tool in the ribbon toolbar is the appearance tool. And the appearance tool, as I mentioned before, and I quickly kind of wiped some pre-existing materials, is the tool that we use to apply our shaders, right, or our materials inside of Fusion. I'll make one quick distinction for those of you that are, might ask. This is a question that comes up all the time. In Fusion, there's appearances and there's physical materials, and they're different. The importance that you need to know is that appearances are the visual materials that we apply to models for the purpose of rendering, right? They're purely for appearance. They're purely visual. They're all about making our designs look good and render them out as photorealistic renderings. Physical materials inside of Fusion, which you'll also find if you go back in the model workspace and right-click on the top of the browser, you'll find physical materials and appearances. Physical materials are the actual material characteristics of the components that you're building. So we can make something look like it's wood, but if we apply a physical material of aluminum, it's going to have the weight, mass, center of gravity, material characteristics of aluminum, as an example. So that comes in handy when you're in like the simulation workspace and you're going to run a finite element analysis and you want to find out, at what point will this part break, right? Or what happens when we apply a thermal load to it or something like that. So important to know, appearances, just for rendering. Physical materials are for simulations. And I see Stephen asked a question, so appearances don't affect CAE, but physical materials do. And that's exactly right. So, appearances are just for rendering. They're just the visual that you see inside of the Fusion session as well as when you render them out. All right, so let's dive in and talk a little bit about our appearances. So you'll see appearances, keyboard shortcut A on the in Fusion is a simple way for us to start applying shaders or, again, materials on top of our designs. You'll see inside of the appearance dialog box, all the way at the bottom is the appearance library. Now, the appearance library is broken up into a handful of folders that are fairly intuitive, I would say, to use, just based on typical classifications of materials: glass materials, metal, paints, plastics, wood, etc. You'll also find across the top of the library we have a couple different tabs. The first of which is the Fusion 360 Appearance Library, which is what you'll be in by default. And then you'll also have your Cloud Appearance Library, which is a way for you to create materials and then save them into your cloud storage location, right, attached to your Fusion 360 user profile, so that you can kind of access them later, right? If you're going from one workstation to another, or you constantly use or you frequently use materials, you can save those with your login so that you can access them really easy. And then favorites. You can also grab materials, add them as a favorite so that you can easily grab them inside of the design that you're working on. So last, back into the appearance library, let's start applying some materials, right? And let's talk about how we can edit them and use them inside of Fusion. So I'm going to jump into the plastic material library, and you'll see inside of there are some kind of sub-classification: opaque plastics, textured plastics, translucent, transparent. We're going to grab a textured plastic, and I'm going to grab this random textured plastic, which means that the bump map, which we'll talk about later, is in a random pattern, right? As opposed to, you'll see like a polka dot pattern, which will have little dots on it or something like that. But before I apply that texture, I want to point out one other thing. You'll see that 2 of these 4 textured plastics are, kind of white, and 2 of them are gray, and they have that little download arrow. So if you're not doing it today, I encourage you to check this box to show downloadable materials. One of the awesome benefits of using a cloud-enabled platform like Fusion is that you can access, and we're constantly adding new materials and shaders into the library, and you can download them when you need them. So if they're within an update, we add some new materials, all you have to do is hit the download arrow, and in a matter of seconds, that material will be local and ready to be used in your design. So just another great way that we kind of use the power of the cloud and give you kind of more tools that are always accessible to you. So back to what I was mentioning, we're going to grab a random textured plastic. We'll drag and drop this onto my design, and it's really that simple, right? Drag and drop onto an object. I right now have my appearance settings set to bodies and components, so I just applied that random textured plastic to the entire component, and I'll do it again on the other side. And there you have it, right? It's drag and drop. All I have to do is drop that onto a component, and it'll apply that shader or that texture to the part of my reciprocating saw. Now, the next thing I might want to do is make some changes to that material. So you'll see at the bottom of my in this design portion of the appearance dialog, I have a number of materials that I've used in the past, as well as some that are being used on the internal components inside of this saw. So what I'll do is I'll right-click on the black textured plastic that I added, and you'll see I have a number of different options. I can edit that texture. I could duplicate it, right? If I wanted to, maybe I needed to have 2 different textured plastics. One that had a, was more rough or was semi-transparent or a different color or something like that. It's as easy as duplicating them right here. I can always use this button to select the objects that material has been applied to, which is an easy way to kind of globally select all of the black plastic components or all of the aluminum components if I wanted to make a change. And you'll also see I can unassign and delete that material, which will just kind of take it out of the in this design library and remove it from anything that it's been applied to. So I'll go ahead and we'll just go ahead and edit this material, and you'll see now I have the ability to fine-tune a number of different factors that make up this material. First, I can control the color. So I have an RGB value and a slider that'll allow me to maybe find my specific brand color, right, or the color that I wanted to work on. You'll see it's as easy as kind of inputting an RGB value, and I can even jump into color libraries, which was added a couple of releases ago, and find a Pantone color specifically. So this is a great way, if you're using a specific Pantone color, you can search the library, you can find a very specific Pantone color and use that, making sure that your photorealistic renderings are going to look as realistic as possible because you're using the measured color or the measured Pantone value. And now you can really dial in the lights and shadows to make sure that you're getting a realistic result. So back to this material here, I'm just going to edit it, and I will, we're going to go with, I don't know, I don't see any suggestions. I don't know what I want to go with today. We'll make this, I don't know. I love like lightning bright green, so we're going to go with some type of a green saw, and I'll leave it like that for right now. And we'll talk a little bit more about the other values that I can change, the other ways that I can edit the material. So you'll see down at the bottom I have a couple other options. Scale, which will scale the material, so scaling it up or down, in this case making that number smaller. You can see actually scaled the material smaller. It made the texture inside of the plastic tighter, right? It's looks like a much finer tooth or kind of grain to the textured plastic, which is might be what I want, right? I don't want it to look it doesn't have like a sandpaper finish. I want it to be a little bit more fine than it was before, and we can control that just by kind of bumping this up or down, which is effectively scaling the entire texture, the entire appearance at the same time. I can rotate the texture. This is important and really helpful if you were doing something like wood grain as an example, where of course this textured plastic is kind of random, so it doesn't have a direction per se, but some materials do, right? Maybe you want the brushed finish on an aluminum to go in one direction versus the other, or the wood grain, like I mentioned, you want it to flow across the part one way versus the other. You'll also find a couple other tools inside of here, like roughness and reflectance. Reflectance changing, how reflective the material is. But I'll also jump into the advanced material options, and we'll dive deeper into the material editor and some of the other values that you can control and change here inside of Fusion 360. So now that I'm diving deeper into the material types, you'll see I can control, turn on or turn off translucency, and then also at what depth do I want this material to be translucent? So here's a great way, that we can, not only make it semi-translucent, but we can make that light kind of dissolve or only penetrate through a certain depth of the material. You'll see. I always struggle saying this word. I'll say light, making something light emissive. Emissivity, there we go. Emissivity is the way to make an object emit light. And I'll show an example of this later, but this is another awesome thing to talk about, that we can make any material and therefore any object inside of Fusion 360 emit light, make it light emitting. So think if I was designing this reciprocating saw and it had a little tiny LED indicator on it, right? And I certainly want to have that in there, and that LED is going to, it's going to apply a little bit of light in the scene. It's going to bounce around, maybe give me a little bit of a highlight or a reflection on the ground, something like that. We can do that very easily by checking this box inside of the material editor. The last two that I'll talk about are the relief pattern, or bump map, if you're familiar with that terminology. And the bump map is the texture map that's being applied to our object that's giving it, in this case, that textured plastic, right? So you'll see when I turn that off, the bump map goes away, right? It makes it kind of a smooth plastic. And when I turn it on, what Fusion is doing, if you're not familiar with this, is it's using this kind of alpha channel image, and it's applying that texture on top of all of the other material properties of this appearance. And then inside of here, I can control, I can change the sample size that this is using. I can change the way that this tiles or repeats. I could rotate this. This is another way that you could, control the orientation of the bump map or something like that. And if you want to change this, all you have to do is just click on the source of the image, and then it'll take you out locally to where you can, change this to any other bump map texture that you might have. I believe I have one right here. I thought I had one right here. I'm never right where I want it to be. I'll find that and I'll show it to you guys a little bit later. But yeah, all you have to do is switch that to a different texture, and then it'll swap out that bump texture with whatever image you might be using. And last, cutouts. So what we can use cutouts for is a way to, again, apply an alpha channel image and make parts of my my product or my material translucent and parts of it not. So think about like the diamond grate that would be on like a staircase, like an industrial staircase, right? It has kind of little tiny diamonds, and to have to do that, or the mesh on the front of a speaker, an earbud, or something like that. Perfect examples where adding all of those holes is very computationally expensive. It takes time. If you do a lot of patterns, we can just essentially fake that, right? We can do that with using a cutout material, which is another great way that we can, again, fine-tune our designs in Fusion. All right, I'm just going to look over at the questions here. I see Marty is answering some of them. Adele is asking, are there any modules for making use of computational design? Adele, I assume you're talking about like scripting or something like that, like a tool like Grasshopper in the industry, or Dynamo, where you're kind of creating and writing language to generate shapes. I'd have to look inside of Fusion today. There's not, but there's a rich API and there's a ton of add-ins. I know that internally some people at Autodesk are working on connecting Dynamo to Fusion to be able to do that. So more to come on that. I think that's kind of at the core of what you're asking. And I'd say take a look. It's been a while since I've kind of investigated what is out there. But I think you'll see, some more capabilities coming and certainly being built out by third-party partners as well. All right, let's move on. Back to our design here. Let's continue and apply some more materials. I'm looking at this green that I added before, and I actually kind of hate it. So I'm going to make a change to it. We'll make this a different color. I don't know, a blue today or something like that. Here's a color we'll go with. Okay, so next, let's go back into our appearance library, and I want to apply the materials for the rest of the saw. So look back in my my appearance library, and I know on the back I might want to apply a rubber grip or a rubber overmold to the handle grip. So go inside of our other library. Inside of the rubber library, and then you'll find a number of different rubbers as well, again, as ones that can be downloaded, like a bumpy or a weathered rubber. So I'm going to use a soft rubber, drag and drop, apply that to my design here, and I might even come in and make changes to it if I wanted, if I didn't want it to be black. But you'll see, if we kind of zoom in here, this has a really nice kind of texture on it, giving that kind of matte finish that a rubber would have. All right, next we'll just apply a material to the front of our saw. And the example that I always use, if you've kind of sat in on this session before, it's always one of my favorites whenever I talk about any type of rendering. What would be a rendering demo without using some carbon fiber? So I'll just drag and drop carbon fiber out of the library onto the front end of our saw. Not because I think we need to make carbon fiber reciprocating saws, but because it looks super cool. And it also gives us a great chance a little bit later to talk about texture mapping. The weave inside of a carbon fiber is a really good example where I might want to change or in some cases in your designs you might want to change the way that Fusion is applying these textures to make sure that they look as realistic as possible. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, so I've gotten about as far as I want to for the moment, right? I've applied my materials around my saw. I'm going to close the appearance library, and next we're going to jump into scene settings. So as I mentioned before, working left to right, scene settings will be the next tool that I'll use, and the place where we create and fine-tune both the environment and the camera that we're using inside of Fusion 360. So starting, again, top to bottom, left to right, we'll start off in the settings dialog box, and the first thing that you'll find is the brightness value of the environment. Now, to take a step back, there's a couple different ways that we can apply light, we can add environments inside of Fusion 360. You'll see we can use an environment, which is going to be driven from the environment library that you'll find in the second tab, and uses a HDR image or a dome high dynamic range image to not only apply and put a an image in the background, but also as our image-based lighting sources. So inside of these libraries, we'll just grab one quickly out of here, drag and drop it into the scene. We'll put this outside in the old plaza environment, and if we were to zoom out here, you'll see I have a really nice exterior plaza environment, cobblestone wood on the ground, and the light sources are being driven from the environment themselves, right? This kind of sun source, and then all of the reflections and lights in this scene are being driven from the environment. Now, the other thing that we can choose to do is put this in a solid color environment, and that might be a great way for us to apply or put our design again juxtapose against our brand colors, right? So maybe for some reason this is a real poppy reciprocating saw, and I want it to be blue and purple, right? Or I don't know, we're selling these on Easter, so I'm using pastel colors or something like that. This is a great way for us to apply a single color in the background. And again, we could always render this on white, on black, many different ways that we can use just the plain color background or solid color as well. So I'll switch back into the environment really quickly, and we'll go back to the top and talk about the brightness. Luke said he was very romantic. Thank you. I don't know, Luke, if you thought my blue and purple were romantic or this plaza. I think he probably meant the plaza. Yeah, this looks like the scene where someone proposes to somebody else in a romantic comedy. So great point, Luke. So back to the brightness value. Let's take a look at how this works. So you'll see what I can do is adjust the value here, and I'm just gonna copy it really quickly. And we're gonna take it down to 0, and just hopefully, like you'd expect, 0 brightness means 0 light, right? There's no longer any light in the scene. So what I've done is effectively said that the image-based lighting inside of the plaza environment, let's take that down to 0, and now there's actually no light source because I don't have any light-emitting materials inside of the scene as well. So if we start to bump that up, and we'll make it 100. We might have to go a little higher than that, make it 1,000. Now you'll start to see, right? Now it's like, sunset or something like that, right? Like a really dark, dynamic scene. If I add another 0, we'll make it 1,000. Now I'm getting back, closer to what it was by default. So know that excuse me, that brightness value is a way that we can control the image-based lighting in our scene. Now back to my scene environment. I don't want to render my reciprocating saw outside. I'm actually going to change between a couple different environment libraries just to show you a little bit more about the image-based lighting and how it works. So first I'll just drag and drop, and I'm going to put this in the skylight environment, which you'll see is an environment where the light sources are all kind of overhead, right? Like looks like a bunch of skylights inside of a room or an atrium or something like that. And so for that reason, you'll see the shadows are cast straight down because the light source is primarily directly overhead. And so to talk about some different ways that we can use these HDR environments to our advantage, I'm going to change to a warm light environment. Again, this is another one that comes out of the box. And warm light, just like it sounds, if we were to look at some of the highlights here, what I'll do is just position this so that we can hopefully see. Oh, there it is. So if you look at the highlights inside of, or on the side of my saw here, they're all kind of warm, right, as the name suggests. And the reason being, the light source in this kind of photography, traditional photography photo booth setting has a red and yellow hue to it, right? Meaning it's a warm light. So that's obviously why these lights and these shadows, reflections, are casting or having a warm glow to them. And just the same, if we change that to cool light, you'll see that that environment swaps out. This light source is now, has a blue and a really kind of whitish blue light to it, which changes those highlights, right? And makes a very, makes a big difference in terms of, setting this up. If I wanted this product to, kind of have cooler hues to them, or it was going to be in a warmer, lighting environment, very easy for us to switch those out. Austin's asking, can we cover importing HDRIs? Perfect time to talk about it, Austin. And yes, it's right down here at the bottom, attach custom environment. You can import your own HDRs if you have them. You'll find, if you're not familiar with what they are, get out there on the Google machine, look up HDR environment. You'll find no shortage of thousands and thousands of sources out there. Some free, some that are for purchase, and absolutely worth every penny if it means kind of creating and making the scene look as realistic as possible. So really, all you have to do is attach it here. You'll be able to apply it to your scene, and then you can come in and do what we'll talk about next, which is start to change and kind of fine tune the environment settings. So working down through the settings library, the next thing we'll talk about is the position tool. And the position tool is, just like it sounds, it actually positions the environment around the object, not the other way. So what this is doing is it's allowing us, using this slider to rotate the environment around my product. And again, I said that purposely just so that you realize, I'm not rotating my object. I don't have to go into model workspace and move and rotate. I can just purely rotate the scene around my design. Now, what's awesome about that is, if I wanted to control where those highlights fall, right, where the light source is coming from, you can see the primary light source is now in front, or relative to my view. It's on this side of my saw, and I can change that just by rotating it around, setting up and controlling where my highlights fall and where that shadow is being cast. I can also change the ground scale. This would be ideal in that plaza environment if I wanted to scale the cobblestone up or down. And then I can use the slider here, or the handles, to move the ground plane up or down away from my object. This is great if you designed your object and it's kind of looks like it's floating in space. You can just adjust the height of the ground plane. Now, if you're wondering where did that ground plane come from, you'll see I already had it on in my design by default. But in the next section of the settings dialog, there's a few options that you should take a look at. First, whether or not to turn on a ground plane. So you'll see when it's turned off, I no longer see those shadows. I don't see the reflection. I don't even see any type of a ground plane, right? It looks like this is just kind of floating on top of a gray background. So if you turn on ground plane, then you can control a couple other options. Flattened ground is kind of ideal inside of especially in an exterior or a realistic environment where you'll see it actually flattens out the ground and gives you like a focal point or a horizon in the background, and makes the object look like it's sitting on the ground. And then you could turn on or off reflections, and of course reflections being the reflection that's down here in the ground plane. And then you can control the reflection with a slider between 0 and 1. 0 being highly reflective, right? So you can see that looks like kind of like a mirrored finish, like a shiny marble on the ground or something like that. And if you take that all the way to 1, you'll see it's a lot more diffused, right? It's more subtle. It's not as highly reflective. So we'll leave that back in the middle here around, I don't know, 3 or something like that, because I think I like the way that looks, and we're going to move on. So next, let's talk about the camera. So our camera settings inside of Fusion mimic traditional photography and makes it really easy for us to control and adjust the individual camera settings inside of our rendering environment. So by default, first you can control the view of the camera, and these are the same 3 settings that are inside of Fusion globally. We have orthographic views, which are have no perspective and make the object look exactly as they would in an orthographic view, right? There's no focal point. If I look at this in a pure side view, it is as if this thing is completely flat, right? No focal point in space, and that's what an orthographic view will do. A perspective view changes that, right? It actually adds a focal point. It kind of, if you're familiar with good old-fashioned, hand drawing, this adds a focal point in space. You'll see all of these objects, these angles, these lines are all diving back towards this focal point, probably somewhere back here on the horizon, which mimics the way that we see things in real life, right? So it kind of adds that realism that you're going to be able to see the inside of the saw guard, right? It's not going to be a complete flat projection when you look at it. And then the third option is what I consider the best of both worlds. Perspective with ortho faces. So what that does is it enables that when you're in any tumbled view, right, as you orbit around the saw, or as you orbit around your scene, I should say, it is a perspective view. And then if you go into a true top, right, front, side view using the view cube, it will actually snap it into an orthographic view. So what I love about this is if I need to look, and maybe I just need the profile of the saw, right, or I need just I want to see the edges, right, the lines in this kind of curvature over here. I would put that in a true side view, and then as soon as I tumble or orbit around, now I'm back inside of a perspective view. Next, focal length. So again, this mimics traditional photography settings. If I set this to a 90mm focal length, that's more like a traditional portrait photography setting. If I were to kind of bump this down to 55mm or 35mm, this is going to become a more like a wide-angle lens, right? It's going to exaggerate the front of the saw and those types of things. Also, the next thing I'll talk about, but I'll show later, is depth of field. So inside of Fusion, we can turn on depth of field. And if you're not familiar with what depth of field means, depth of field is a way that we focus the camera on, at a length, or in this case, we pick an object, an area in the scene, and that becomes the area focus. That becomes in focus, and then objects that are further away in the foreground and in the background become more and more blurry, right? So all we have to do is turn on depth of field, focus the camera by clicking on an object. You'll see that little green dot, and then when I ray trace this out, and I won't see this until later, based on this blur factor, objects that were in the background, the front of the saw that's in the foreground, they'll become more and more blurry, and I'll show you some examples of that a little later. All right, so I'm going to make a couple last changes here. I'm going to go back to my skylight environment because I like the way that looks. And now we're ready to move on into talking a little bit about decals. We'll talk about texture mapping, and then it's time to render. It's time to see what this thing looks like in real life. I'm going to pause and just look really quickly at some of the questions. I see Marty is doing a great job of answering them as we go. Stephen asks, can you explain cloud-based rendering? Absolutely not yet. We'll talk about it in a minute, Stephen, when we get to the rendering tools. But yeah, that's going to be a great conversation and a good point for us to spend some time on talking about how that works inside of Fusion. I don't see any other questions, so let's keep moving on. So the next thing that I'm going to do, and if you could see in the back part of my saw here, I've already got one there, so I'm going to delete it and we'll add it again, is add a decal. And so the third button in the across the top of the toolbar is the Decal Tool, and the Decal Tool allows us to do just like it sounds, apply an image to use as, again, little details, decal stickers. It might be a warning label. It could be, could be a paint texture or something like that to your products, to your objects. So with the Decal Tool, all we have to do is first select the face that we want to apply the decal to. Now there's two different ways that you can do this. You'll see, you can either choose to chain faces or not. I'm going to start without chain faces turned on to show you how it works. So the way that works is if you select the face, this is the face, in this case the one singular face that I've selected that I want this decal to be applied to. Then all I have to do is browse out locally and find the image that I want, in this case my warning label that we've got right here. So I'll go ahead and apply that, and now I can use the handles inside of Fusion to rotate, scale, move this warning label around my scene. And you'll see, Fusion does a really nice job of both mapping this across the surfaces, mapping it around bends and things like that. Again, making it really realistic in the way that it applies this on top of objects. But let's talk a little bit more about what is going on here. So first, I mentioned before chain faces, and you probably saw as I was moving this around, as I move that decal off of the single face that I selected, it actually gets cut off, which might be what I want, right? This might be a really neat way for me to make sure that a decal or a graphic terminates on a surface or across a surface or something like that. But in another scenario, I might want that to wrap around the corner. And so I could either have gone in and selected more faces. So I'll go into, when you apply a decal, you'll find that it gets added in the browser underneath the component that you applied it to, or inside of the browser in a decals folder if it's on a body. And you can right-click and hit Edit Decal. And what I can do now is either I could just click on another face, right, to apply it across, two faces in this case, or turn on chain faces, which means it'll let you apply that decal to any face that you move it onto or across, right? So now, as I move this around, it's just being projected across all of the faces that I selected on. Also in this dialog box, we can, kind of enter in a scale factor. You can flip these vertically and horizontally, right, if it came in backwards or you need to mirror it or something like that. And then once I hit OK, you'll see I've applied that decal, right here on the, on the right side of my reciprocating saw. Maybe just a great way to, to show off that warning label. There's two questions I see came in. Do you know any quick reference images of materials in the library? Something like a chart with examples of the materials rendered on a cube or a sphere that you can reference outside of Fusion. John, the short answer is I don't know of one. They're obviously all inside of Fusion, and you can actually, one thing I didn't talk about before, I believe you can change the little thumbnail type from, the little, I don't know, the little infinity A360 swoopy thing to a sphere, to a cube. I don't know of an external reference. I can look into that though. Thanks for asking the question. If I can find something, I'll certainly send it over to you. I'll shoot you an email, or if I find it, I'll send it over to everyone that's in the session today. I don't know of any that's external right now, but certainly it could be in our help, or it might be out there in the forums or something like that. Stephen's question, Stephen had asked, are decals just stickers? Can I use it to emboss or engrave? Yes. So if you want, so I would say if you want to emboss or engrave, you can certainly do that. A couple ways you can do it, both physically, by using the text tool, by importing an SVG or a vector format and using that to actually alter the 3D materials. The Decal tool does respect transparency, so if you bring it in as a TIFF or a PNG, that would let you make sure that you don't have a a square or a white block around your decal. But today the decals they appear mostly like stickers. They have a like a sticker or a glossy finish, which you can't edit at this point. And I'd say if you want to engrave it, or you want to have some type of an engraving, the best way to do it would probably be to do it physically, unless you wanted to try it out any other way. Depends on maybe what you were trying. You might be able to achieve something close to what you want with the Decal tool. So I hope that helps. You said it makes sense. Good. Excellent. Let's move on. All right, so now it's time time for us to talk about the texture map controls inside of Fusion 360. So I've actually, since I've already worked in this file before, they've already been tweaked or changed. But I'm just going to go through and talk about how these work. So the texture map tool inside of Fusion is a way for you to change the orientation in the way that Fusion applies a texture on top of your bodies or components. And what that means is Fusion is actually going ahead and it's taking the material texture, so that's the bump map and the roughness factor and the color and all of the values that we talked about before, and it's projecting those onto the 3D objects with a number of different projection types. So if we were to select on the housing right here, and I'm just going to set it back to automatic and say OK, because this is a good example in what you might see from time to time. So the saw, or the housing of the saw, is made up of a bunch of different surfaces, right? Surfaces that are different patches, right? You can see how easily I can select them right here by clicking on the edges. And if you see with the automatic projection type, which is the default, it actually didn't do a great job of mapping and blending that texture across multiple different surfaces. So in this little four-corner example right here, you can see that the texture is, it's scaled a little bit differently in this on this patch, and then it's, kind of it gets stretched as it turns around the corner here by the handle of the saw, and I can see the seams, right? So if I use the texture mapping tools, going back in here really quickly, I can select on an object and then change that projection type to a couple different options. The first one that you'll see is planar. A planar projection means, and it allows you to make a selection. What's the axis or the direction that we're going to apply this material? So I'll just say, let's apply it along the z-axis by selecting the blue indicator there, and I'll say OK. And if we look at this from a side profile, you can see that that issue that I was having here is gone, right? Because now it's actually projecting that material normal, or in this case parallel to my view, the way that I'm looking. But if we were to rotate around and look at the depth or the middle of this saw, it's being stretched because that's parallel to the angle that we're projecting this texture. So this wouldn't be a great example, wouldn't be the right tool to use for an object like this saw that kind of has faces that are going in multiple directions. Maybe a great thing to use for like the a tabletop, right? A flat surface or something like that. Planar projection might make a lot of sense. So we'll go back into texture map controls here. We'll talk about some others. The next, box. So a box projection type is the one that I had on before that you saw. It's probably going to be the best example for this geometry. A box selection or a box projection type is projecting the material like it would from 6 directions of a box, right? From the front, from the right, from the top, from the bottom, and then it blends those edges together, blends that projection together. So this is, by and large, this saw is, kind of rectilinear, right? In the sense that it has a flat top, which would get projected fairly well. This face on the side here is, kind of planar and would project really well. This face that was getting stretched before, it's being projected from the right. So it actually applies it very nicely, and then you can use the handles to rotate and change the direction of that, the orientation. The other two, spherical and cylindrical, make perfect sense, right? You wouldn't want to use a box projection if you were, mapping a basketball, right? Something that was spherical. So that's when you would use spherical and cylindrical. Cylindrical would probably be the ideal texture to use for the back of the handle here, right? Because this overmold grip is cylindrical, right? It's kind of rounded and would have, maybe projections on the top for the top and the bottom. All right, so now that we've spent a little bit of time, I lied. I usually do that with the carbon fiber, but I did it with the plastic today. So the carbon fiber is purely just because I like carbon fiber. So now it's time for us to start rendering. So what I'll do now is, I just want to set up my scene. So as I rotate, just think the rotation tool is the camera, right? So wherever I set up my my view, that becomes the camera. That becomes where and how I render this model. So we're going to set up like a 3/4 view right here, and now as someone had asked earlier, it's time to start rendering. So there's a couple different options that we have in ways that we can render in Fusion 360. The first of which is an in-canvas render. So if I press the in-canvas render button, what Fusion's going to start to do is, excuse me, it's going to enable the ray tracing tools inside of Fusion. If you're not familiar with what ray tracing is, ray tracing in the visualization world is the way that we project and trace light, right? Trace beams or rays of light as they bounce around the scene, right? Certain colors are going to be absorbed by objects. Certain colors are going to reflect, which are the ones that we see in the visible light spectrum. That's going to cause reflections, shadows, that ambient occlusion that you see when objects are really close to one another, and they kind of cast a slight shadow. And as I sit here and talk away, you'll see in about 50 seconds, Fusion has gone through about 29 iterations of tracing these beams of light, and the object is starting to look more and more realistic, right? This is where we see, the actual realistic materials inside of Fusion 360. Before I ray traced, they looked nice, right? The texture on the plastic looked good, but it wasn't realistic. It wasn't, it wasn't calculating the lights properly in the scene. I wasn't getting any color bleed from when a blue object is close to the ground, like we'll start to see down here with the actual reflection and things like that. So now what's great about in-canvas rendering, or just kind of calculating and ray tracing in this scene, is I can very quickly get an idea. I get a result, and this indicator on the bottom allows me to set up, what am I going for? Do I want to let it calculate until I get, a really good rendering? I can change that and shoot for like a final, like a high quality rendering, or I can move it all the way to infinite, which means just keep going, right? Just continue to, do more iterations of this rendering forever until I say to stop. So this indicator gives us a good idea of, how long did we let it kind of cook long enough, right, to get a photorealistic example. But now the one thing about rendering with the in-canvas render is it is both using my local resources, right? So my local graphics processor is what's calculating and creating this rendering, and it's also using the Fusion session, right? So as you can tell, right now I'm in this rendering, right? I can't model, I can't try a new material without having to recalculate the rendering inside of the scene. So what that means is as soon as I go to rotate, right, and I'll just rotate this to another view, it's time to start all over, right? We're back to iteration number 0, and it's going to start re-rendering this scene. So this is, again, a great way to, it's certainly a way that we can create and capture photorealistic renderings. Once you create them, you can capture those images and save them out using the Capture Image button. This will be limited to the resolution of your monitor. So just keep that in mind, right? If you need something bigger, is where you probably want to use the render tool, which we'll talk about next. All right, so I'm going to turn off in-canvas render, and now, as someone asked about before, let's talk about render, the little teapot button that you'll see inside of the scene. So now the render tool is a way for us to, again, render out high-quality images, and we can do that one of two ways. You'll see inside of the render settings dialog, we can render with Cloud Renderer or Local Renderer. And now the difference between the two, first, the Cloud Renderer, just like it sounds, and like someone asked, the Cloud Renderer will take this scene, right? All of the materials that I've applied, the camera, environments, etc., and it'll offload that process to the Autodesk Cloud, where it will create the rendering for me. Now, what's awesome about that is, I mentioned before, both using the Fusion session and using my local resources. When I send this off to the cloud, it actually just puts it in queue along with hundreds or thousands of other renderings. And in this case, you'll see the queue time. I should get a result back in less than 20 minutes. Now, I typically see when I see less than 10 minutes, less than 20 minutes, I get a result back in minutes. But it's kind of a cue or an idea for you about how long it will take. The other thing that you'll see is that it uses cloud credits. Now, cloud credits are not unique to Fusion, not unique to the render environment in Fusion. There's a couple different workspaces that use this concept of a cloud credit, right? A currency, a token, to be able to use the cloud resources. Depending on the type of subscription that you have, will control or make available a number of cloud credits. And you can always add more, right? If this is a great resource for you, where you start to use it more and more, and we have a lot of customers taking advantage of it, both on the rendering side as well as in the simulation environment, you can always add more to your account. So going back a step, again, it's going to take 2 cloud credits for me to render out an image with these settings. Now those settings I can change, right? You can see across the top, I can optimize those for web, for mobile, for print, right? If there was a certain size or pixels per inch that I was kind of I wanted to go towards, and then I can always just set it to a custom setting and then browse through different aspect ratios, different optimization for web, print, mobile, and video. So now that I'm about ready to do that, I'm just going to set up this rendering again really quickly and go back into render. So the other part that's really great about using the cloud and offloading the render, I should say, to these processes is rendering becomes a parallel process as opposed to a serial process. And what I mean by that is right now, in my time zone, it's 2 o'clock. I usually love this example about 3 minutes ago when I can say, what if I had a design meeting at 2 o'clock, right? Or what if I had a design meeting 10 minutes from now and I need to bring 10 renderings, 10 concepts, right? It might be this saw in 3 different material types, in 2 different environments, and with 5 different design alternates, right? What would it look like? Different materials. What would it look like, with this concept versus that concept? And to do that by, kind of rendering and ray tracing these out one at a time would become a very long process. If you've done this before, you know what I'm talking about, right? It takes, a lot of time to allow those renderings to calculate. But doing it and offloading it to the cloud makes it a parallel process. So what I mean is, if I hit render, it's going to go ahead and save my document and offload this rendering to the cloud. In about less than 10 minutes, I should get my result back. And now what I could do, rather than waiting 10 minutes for this one rendering to be done, and then turn out that maybe I don't like it, maybe I need to make a change, maybe I need to make it green, I could rotate this model around, change a material really quickly. We'll grab my green textured plastic and apply that here, and we'll focus on the warning label, and I'll go back to render. I'll hit render on the cloud, and now I've got 2 renderings that are being solved for me simultaneously. Right? And then I can continue to do this as many times as I need. But again, the value of doing that is that I've basically unlocked this process. So if you look down here in my rendering gallery, you can see I've done this a time or 2 before. I've got a bunch of examples from doing just this session on like a monthly basis. But I want to call your attention to a couple things. First, if you look, here's my 2 new renderings that are right now being rendered out to the cloud. Right, so the thumbnails will start to preview once once they get a little further through the rendering cycle. But also, here's all the previous renderings that I've done before. And also, if you look in the bottom corner, it indicates what version of that file that rendering was created with. So what's awesome about that is I know that this this rendering right here, right, this yellow saw, this was tied to version number 6, which might be 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, last year, right? Before I made some design changes, before I tweaked this and we came up with a new concept. So it's great to know that Fusion's always going to maintain that there is a connection between the state of the model, right? The data that you've created, the version, and how that connects to the rendering that you've created. Now, if you look down here on the bottom, my first rendering has popped up. It's kind of flying through the process. It's almost about ready to be complete. And then the other thing I'll point out over here on the right is the Render on Save gallery. And what's great about this is you can actually take any rendering that you create. So let's say, this orientation, this camera setting that I created before, which is actually done, ready for us to take a look at. I'll just open up that thumbnail. There it is. I can take this, drag and drop it into the Render on Save gallery, and now what that will do is every time that I save this file, Fusion in the background will go and update this rendering with the latest and greatest data. So if we go back through the design cycle and we start to change these vents as an example, as I'm working in Fusion and I change the vents to a different design, I hit save, Fusion's going to go and re-render this view with these materials, camera settings, scene settings, orientation, etc. It's going to update that for me. So I'll always have up-to-date renderings with the latest and greatest data. Super important, really helpful. When you have someone come walk over your shoulder and say, "Hey, I want to see the latest and greatest," right? You don't necessarily always have time to say, "No problem. I'll be in your office in 4 hours when I make my renderings." They're always ready, right? They're always there for you. All right, I'm going to look back at the questions here really quickly and see. I see Marty is answering a few of these. I'll look down here at the bottom. Does Cloud Render remember your XYZ position if you want to go back to the same position later? So I think what you're asking is, so I'll answer your question, I think, 2 ways, and thinking it's one or the other. So your XYZ position, the position or the orientation of the model, absolutely. These are all tied to that. So you can come in here, and you could re-render this, right, as a, with an update. You just have to hit the re-render button and it'll re-render that scene. Or the other thing that I suggest you use is inside of Fusion, you can create named views. And named views are a great way to, create, so here's my obligatory warning label rendering that I've made before. I come in here into named views, right-click name view, and we'll name this warning label. And now you can always recall that position later, right? So you just come back into the browser, hit warning label, and it'll take us back to that view. So that's another way that you can do it. Stephen, it looks like you said named view it is. Good. So I hope that helps. And yeah, I do that constantly, not only in the rendering workspace, but it's there in the model workspace, right? If you always want to go back to the same orientation or view or something like that. Adele asked, what is the pricing for cloud rendering option? Great question. So I think by default, every subscription has 100 cloud credits, every Fusion 360 subscription. If you're a Fusion 360 Ultimate subscriber, I believe it's 1,000 because there's a lot of tools in the simulation workspace that use that cloud render token as the way that it works. And then cloud credits are, I think they're in bundles of 100 for about $100. So they're about $1 a piece. So if it's, again, something you use frequently, you just add more to your account. And I also believe if you're a part of a larger organization, they can be pooled together as well. So just another way to do that. Stephen asked, named views across the app is why Fusion 360 is better than the other guys. I'll just say the other guys because I'm recording this. Thanks, Stephen. I'm glad you think that that Fusion 360 is better than everything else because I selfishly and not ashamed to say I agree. All right, so let's dive back in here. So we've talked a little bit about rendering. The other thing I didn't talk about was local rendering, which is 100% the same, but it uses your local resources and it doesn't use cloud credits. So, I mean, this is another great way to leverage the renderer. Of course, this one's going to happen locally, but what's nice about this is when you hit render, it offloads that render in the background, and you can still use Fusion. So when I hit render here, I can still tumble, I can still change design, etc., without having to lock up my session like the in-canvas render tool does. All right, so let's switch gears really quickly, and I want to jump over into a different example. And this is one that I like to talk about. So it'll give us a chance to talk about a few other material types, as well as some lighting tools, tips, techniques that you can take advantage of as well. So we're going to jump into our render environment here in my my Barcelona chair and ottoman scene. Again, if you saw from the geometry there, this was just some imported geometry, right? Some assets that I got from somewhere along the way, you know, through our gallery or through a GrabCAD or something like that. And so let's talk about a couple different things here. I talked before about making light-emitting objects. So what we'll do in this example, you can see my lamp has a light bulb in it, and a perfect example of where I might want to, you know, actually light my scene with light-emitting materials, so that, you know, the lampshade was, you know, kind of cascading and creating a cone of light that was being reflected on the table and into the wood, and et cetera, et cetera. So before I render this, I'm just going to make that light bulb glossy plastic, and I'll do that specifically for the reason that I don't want it to emit light right now. And the rest of my materials have kind of already been applied. We'll talk a little bit about some of them later. But just for example's sake, I'm going to hit in canvas render and let this start to render. So now, just like before, my scene, we'll look over into our scene settings. My scene setting are set to a solid color background. So I've got a gray background. My environment lights and shadows are being driven from an environment, in this case the old warehouse environment, right? So I can actually have a gray background with the lights and shadows of an HDR environment. So this is a really nice kind of combination of the two. Maybe slightly unrealistic when you look at the reflection in the chrome right here that you see the old warehouse, but what's nice is that it, you know, it maintains, you know, a realistic light source and reflections and shadows, even though it's just set against a gray background. So if we kind of come back out here, just to point out those couple things, I'll switch this to the environment really quickly, just to show what we're working with here. And there we have it, right? I've got my beautiful Barcelona chair inside of this old warehouse for whatever reason. But as I mentioned before, the lights in this scene are being lit from the image-based lighting, or the HDR environment. So, you know, the lights in the old warehouse are coming from, I'll just turn off the render for a second, are coming from this window, right, which is giving me all the reflections and things like that. Now, let's talk a little bit more about what's going on. So, as I mentioned, the brightness value is controlling how bright those light sources are. So, if I'll just hit in canvas render so we can see what's happening, and I'll take that down, and I'll take it all the way down. In actuality, I'll put this back, sorry, in an environment. I'm going to take this down to 0, right? And just like before, as I mentioned, there's no light in the model, right? Because I have no light-emitting materials. So let's change that really quickly. And we're going to go back to our lamp and see what happens if we make that light bulb a light-emitting object. So in the other library, underneath emissive, you'll find a bunch of light bulbs, or light types, right? LED bulbs. I think there's an incandescent kind of frosted bulb at the top. There's little red, blue, green LED indicators. There's even displays, right? If you're putting a monitor or some type of an indicator in your scene, these are a great way to, you know, kind of cascade out light that would come from, you know, an LCD panel or something like that. So what we'll do is we'll use, excuse me, we'll use the LED bulb. I'll just drag and drop the one that I've already used in the past onto this object. See that it changes, right? It at least looks like it's very bright before it renders. And now let's go back to, you know, kind of our scene orientation here and hit in canvas render. And you can see that that light is now one of the light sources that's you know, kind of cascading out of the lamp and creating, you know, lights and reflections on the leather of the chair and ottoman, on the top of the table. And to make that, to make the point a little bit better, let's take all of the light down again. And now you can see, I'll just let that kind of really dynamic image render here for a minute, but now you can see the only light source inside of my model is coming from that LED bulb inside of the lamp. And so now I have a really dynamic rendering here. We'll zoom in a little bit, where you know, someone went to sleep and left the light on, right? I have the shadows are being cast realistically from the light source that's inside of the lamp. casting a shadow on the dark side of my blue and purple ball right here. The top of the table obviously lit up, underneath it is not, and then it's just kind of catching the left side of the leather on these chairs. So this is just a great example of how we can use emissive lights inside of Fusion. And oftentimes someone will ask, what about lights? Are there ways that I can set up lights? The answer is absolutely. Grab a sphere, a primitive, a cube, put it in space, and make a realistic light source. Right? You don't have to make a a cone light or something like that. Make the realistic lights that are in your scene. You'll get higher quality renderings by doing it. I'll just come in here really quickly because I love to show this reflection on these balls. You can see, right, the inside of the lampshade and the bulb in the reflection of those balls. So just a really, really dynamic and beautiful image that renders out once it's complete. I'm going to come back over here to some questions. Matthew. Matthew said, definitely send all your transparent, translucent renders out to the cloud, 20 minutes versus hours. Thanks, Autodesk. On behalf of Autodesk, I say thank you, Matthew. No, it's a great example. I didn't talk before. I started to talk before about the little indicator that you see down here and the number of iterations. Now, highly reflective materials, translucent materials, right, glass, light sources, they take a lot more time to render, right? It's going to take a lot more iterations. You can see in 50 seconds, almost a minute, it's only done 14 iterations, where in the other example, in about a minute it did almost 60 iterations, right? So it was able to render and calculate a lot faster. Light sources, chrome, highly reflective or transparent objects as well they take more time. So just keep that in mind. And great point, Matthew. It's a great use case for using the cloud. Matthew also said, wow, lighting and material designed for dummies that actually get you good results. Uninstalling KeyShot now. No comment. Thank you, Matthew. KeyShot's a great tool. But yeah, there's a lot of great functionality you can take advantage of here inside of Fusion 360. So glad that you see some of the value there. And Austin asked, if you make the lampshade transparent, how well will the light emit through into the other objects? The short answer to your question is, I don't know. Let's find out. I mean, it absolutely should, kind of give you the result that you would expect, but don't believe me. Let's try it out. So we'll just come in here really quickly, and we'll find like a glass or something like that, right? So glass at the top, and we'll grab a smooth, clear glass, and we'll apply that to our lampshade. Did I miss something here? Let's try that again. There we go. Oh, there's two different material types on there, I think. So now I've got a glass on there, and if we were to hit the in-canvas render button, now and I can also take down. So for one, you see as that starts to render, it's kind of streaking on the glass like you would expect, and those streaks here are the light sources, the windows in the warehouse that are on the right side of my scene. But if we take this back down to 0 again, it's actually just lighting up the rim of the shade, which was a different material, and now it's kind of unadhered, sending that light out through a transparent object. So if this was closer to the ground, or it had some other light, if it had some other objects, right? I mean, you can see the glass, especially there's a smooth glass and there's some other textured glasses, can actually change the shape or the object. You see I'm getting a reflection on the glass on the back side. The bulb is being reflected in the back, and that reflection, I believe, is being reflected into the front of the lampshade, right? Because it's set as glass right now. So it's behaving, I think, I hope, as you would expect, admitting light out. It actually kind of changed the cone of this light. And certainly if there were other objects in the background here, you would see them light up better now than you did before, because there's more light being transmitted out through the object. and you can see that in the chair here. Before, there was a very hard shadow, right, from the cone of the lamp, and now that kind of goes away because light is being pushed out in all directions. And we can just, I'll just jump back here really quickly to illustrate what it looked like before one more time, while I look back to see if there were any other questions. I'll just hit in Canvas Render again, and there you can already see it, right? So when it was glass, it was kind of pushing light all the way through, and now, if we just take this back down, you'll see a a more defined cone of light, right, across the chair there. Austin, I hope that answers your question. So one last thing that I wanted to show and talk about really quickly, that I'll also encourage everyone to throw your questions in the Q&A panel. I'm glad to answer as many other questions that are out there before we wrap up. But the last thing that I wanted to talk about is some other really cool capabilities that we have using the Cloud Render tool set. Now, if I open up the right example in the gallery here, so one thing that we can do when we render out an image, we could also choose, so if I take this image that I've rendered out before, I can choose to re-render this out into the cloud as a turntable. So now a turntable will use cloud credits, and basically what that's going to do based on the options that I give it is it's going to take that one render that I created, the lights, materials, right, the camera that I set up, and based on a 6 or 36 frame option, it's going to go through and turn that into a 360-degree rotatable turntable option. So again, when I talked before about hey, what about when you have to take this to a meeting? If a picture's worth 1,000 words, then a turntable's worth 36,000 words, I guess, because there's 36 frames right here. So check this out. This is a really awesome kind of turntable. You can see the light in the lamp, the cascade of the lamp, onto the ground, and now this is dynamic too. I can click and rotate this around, to take this into my meeting and show off, what my product looks like from all angles. So just another benefit of using Fusion, using that, the cloud credits and the cloud-enabled capabilities that are there for you to use. So the last thing that I'll talk about is what do we do with these when we're done. So I'll just point out quickly, you can share these. You can certainly download these as images, right? If you wanted to have them local or email them or something like that. You can share them out through A360 the same way that you can collaborate and share your images and your designs, I should say, using Fusion. And also, you can share these out to the Fusion 360 gallery. So I had a quick little commercial for the gallery earlier, and I will show. I'll show it again really quickly. So if you haven't used the Fusion 360 gallery yet, or you haven't had a chance to join the community, I encourage you to get out there and see some of the incredible things that our community, our users are doing on a daily basis. So if you get out, look at the Fusion 360 gallery. Here's the latest and greatest, right? Check out some of these incredible designs, incredible renderings that in some cases are being rendered in Fusion, in some cases rendered elsewhere. Some of these are modeled in Fusion, some of these are modeled elsewhere. But just check out the incredible community that we have and some of these amazing designs that are happening inside of Fusion. I love looking in here because I never know what I might run into on a daily basis. Here's a great car that one of our colleagues, Grant, has created, a little concept model. If you haven't seen his examples out there on YouTube, he goes through some really great speed modeling and concepts using the sculpting tools inside of Fusion 360. Love this drum set that's been up here for a while from Alex. Just super realistic, really nicely done, both from a model and from a rendering perspective. This last one I'll point out because it came up on my last session and surprised me. Love this, kind of scaled, deformed 1960s Adam West Batmobile. But again, just another awesome example of the rendering tools inside of Fusion. So get in here, post your stuff. You'll also find a great way to use the Fusion Gallery is, our community, our users, have the ability to choose whether to let you open and or download the model. So this is a really nice way if you just want to be able to view In this case, thanks to Anne from Penn State University, did a really nice job of, I think this was the model of the month this past month. Check out these calipers, right, that she modeled and designed in Fusion. You can view the model, and she also chose to allow it to be downloaded. So I encourage people to do it all the time. Get in here, download another model that someone else created in Fusion. Sometimes you'll learn something just by seeing the steps or the approach that someone else took in using Fusion. All right, so back to the Q&A. Last call for questions. I will stop really quickly and say thank you again, everyone, for spending the time with Marty and I today to talk about the Fusion tools. Please get out there, be active, get in the community. Feel free to tweet at me or post them to me so that I can see some of the great things that you guys are doing in Fusion today. Look for this webinar, the posting. I'll send out some information to everybody, and I believe this one we're going to post over to the YouTube channel, so you should be able to consume this and look back on some of these examples as soon as the beginning of next week. So I see a couple more questions, just a few thank yous, I see Adele asking, can you build and simulate cities in Fusion? So Adele, I'd say the short answer to your question is I think you could probably build just about anything. However, I might say, depending on what you want to do, how you want to simulate them, there might be some better tools out there to do that, right? Like the infrastructure suite of tools from Autodesk, Revit, has some built-in both simulation capabilities from a from a sun path analysis, and we have some CFD tools that can look at wind studies and snow drifting and all kinds of fun things. So the short answer to your question is absolutely. We have some people that are doing some incredible interiors and things like that inside of Fusion. I guess I'd say depending on what you need to do, depending on what your goals are, would be whether or not Fusion's the best tool for the job. So hope that helps. I'd say ultimately the answer is usually yes, just maybe not not as purpose built for infrastructure, for city, for for building and things like that. So hope that helps. Excellent. All right, so thanks everyone for spending the time with us today. Again, I'm going to sign off right now by thanking you for spending the time. Look forward to seeing your renderings in the gallery in the near future. And thanks again, Marty, for being my partner in crime and answering some of these questions. Have a great weekend, everyone, and thanks again for joining.